Welcome everybody for the next part of European Lab. We're going to have a conversation here with Djaïz, who we have given carte blanche to this year. The theme is the battle of narratives around issues of democracy, the challenges to democracy. We do realize that in Europe there are a lot of nationalist narratives which are proving powerful, populist. Yesterday we had speakers from Hungary, for example, who talked about the power of these nationalist narratives conveyed by Viktor Orban and facing a lack of imagination on the part of the European Union, which produces a lot of boredom in its discourse and is struggling to inspire people. And this question of narratives is central to one of the recent works by Djaïz called Slow Democracy, which calls for counter narratives also based on the power of the nations, the protective power of the nation, and also on ecological issues. So we wanted to allow Djaïz to put out some invitations. He'll also be publishing a book soon, this autumn, and I'll hand over to him to moderate this first discussion. Thank you, Anne-Caroline, for the invitation and for the choice of this theme on the battle of narratives, of alternative narratives. We wanted to provide a response on this theme by thinking about a new French and European narrative, if such a thing is possible. And for this first roundtable, I'm delighted to have here, first of all, Nathalie Noguered. You have been a journalist, you're still a journalist for that matter. You headed Le Monde, you're an editorialist at The Guardian, and you have had a quite impressive international career. You're familiar with the Central and Eastern European countries, with Russia, and also the English-speaking world. You have even lived in London and in Canada, unless I'm mistaken. So we will talk with you about the question of the crisis of narratives in the context of Brexit. And also with us, but remotely, I can't yet see them, but I'm sure they will be appearing any minute now on the screen, Giuliano da Empoli, who I'm also delighted to welcome here, who could almost have been here with us if there hadn't been a mechanical breakdown, but he is with us remotely. So Giuliano, you're a writer, essayist. You have written many publications reflecting on policy and politics. You also have been in politics. You were deputy mayor for culture in Florence and senior advisor to Matteo Renzi when he was Italian prime minister. Your books now are translated all over the world. Your latest book was Les Ingénieurs du Chaos, devoted to the, I would almost call it the technique of how to do a coup d'etat, but let's call it the populist techniques. And thank you for being with us here today. And then we're also with Mathieu Lefebvre, who I'm also delighted to be welcoming here today. Mathieu, you have been a diplomat in international organizations. You worked at the UN, the World Bank, and a few years ago you founded an NGO called More in Common, based on the idea that Western democracies in particular were more and more divided, polarized, and that this polarization was becoming an obstacle. This crisis of democracy was becoming an obstacle to public action. I'm delighted to have you here with us today. We'll be talking about More in Common in a moment. Your obsession also is how to come up with a collective positive narrative. But I'd perhaps like to begin by questioning Giuliano da Empoli. We get the impression that over the last 30 or 40 years, Europe has been, and its countries have been somewhat sluggish. Something has broken. The dynamic of the process of growth has slowed down. That ultimately, since the end of the post-war boom, we're struggling to come up with a positive narrative. In the 1980s, we thought that positive narrative might be through the construction of Europe. And since the end of the 90s, we've been going from disappointment to disappointment. So perhaps to begin by reviewing the situation, how do you see this sort of sloth, this sluggishness we are in? How can this great narrative that we managed to put together after the Second World War, has it broken down? I wanted to ask you about this because you have studied politics a lot in the different European countries, and you perhaps have a broader view of this. Thank you, David. Thank you to European Lab for this invitation to be here. I was almost with you today, but I'll be there next year, I promise. I think that what you're talking about in terms of Europe, what you're saying is quite visible. Even if you look at the history of the last year or so, what can we see? You have a divide, a fracture, a gap between the practical concrete achievements and the narrative and the symbolic dimension. So if you look at Europe over the past year, you see progress, considerable progress that has been made. For the first time, we've talked about a Hamiltonian moment, this break with the taboo of a common balance sheet with this big recovery plan, which is perhaps the beginning of something more, which will be coming later. You even with the recent vaccination campaign, the idea that all the European countries, instead of each competing with each other madly to get their hands on the vaccines, should succeed in coming to an agreement and doing that all together, even if the Union didn't have the powers in health at the beginning of the crisis. And then the Green Deal, which provides prospects for growth and for civilization, I would almost say, for the coming decades on our continent. And all of these are concrete, real achievements. But in terms of the narrative and the symbolism, what has been the perception of the past year among most European citizens? In my opinion, they've seen very little of this. These things make some pretty slides in a PowerPoint to be presented to the Council when they're approving the different texts. And at the end, there can be a nice press conference where everybody talks about this. They can have a nice photograph taken, and they have the impression they've done the job they had to. But none of this, or very little of this, ever reaches the European public. And many surveys do tell us that in several European countries, and notably my country, Italy, in the past year, the European feelings have declined because people saw the mess when the COVID crisis erupted, the borders closing. After that, they saw incidents in terms of foreign policy, like the images with Mrs. von der Leyen was not even allowed to sit down in Turkey. I think that struck many people, and a lot of criticisms and a certain amount of confusion surrounding the vaccines. So in a year where Europe has progressed in an extraordinary manner, it actually manages to produce a work of art, a masterpiece, giving the impression that Europe is declining or just stable. And today in Italy, if the situation is saved, it's only because we're getting such a large part of the recovery plan that it's almost as if they're giving a bribe to Italy, and we have to like Europe because we're going to get so much money out of it. But we do see that there is very little attention being paid and very little desire for this narrative of Europe, and that is, I think, a problem from the very origins of the European project. We have always imagined that the narratives, the emotion, the identity, the roots were something that divided Europeans rather than uniting them. And so we have sought to construct this sort of neutral identity, neutral construction with as little conflict as possible, where we think only in terms of laws, legislation and texts. It's as if we were asking people to feel enthusiastic about the discussions at the Council of State in France. So I would say almost that, as you were saying, having said that, the narrative in a way came naturally after the Second World War, with everyone wanting to make sure that that never happened again. So that provided impetus for a phase where people who were in power, who had experienced that war and were familiar, they knew that the details of European construction were in fact a great historic project. So when the technical side didn't work, they would force things through because they were thinking in terms of the historic project, like with Kohl and Mitterrand, who were probably one of the last examples of that way of thinking and working. But obviously all of that has run out of steam quite naturally, and nobody has really wanted to make the effort to produce an identity that might be positive, that might elicit enthusiasm, emotion and narratives surrounding European construction, until the moment when, and Caroline was talking about that in her introduction, where other people in another level were reactivating the thrilling narratives of identity against Europe. And in the last few years, they have been almost the only people speaking about Europe in an exciting way. The people like Orban, like Philippe de Villiers, inventing spy stories about Europe, where everybody is an American spy and corrupt, or like, to some extent, the Matteo Salvinis and people like that. So I think that even before we ask ourselves the question of why are we not managing to construct a genuine European narrative that interests people, we have to ask ourselves why we're not even trying to do it. Thank you for that very interesting introduction. I'll now turn to Nathalie. What do you agree with what Giuliano Dampoli just said? Do you think it is possible to construct a positive, energetic European narrative with as much passion in it as the national narratives? And you, with your experience of British society and Brexit, do you see a fit between the national narrative and the European narrative? What is your view of all this? I wonder, and I love discussing with Giuliano, and I encourage you to read the analysis he published in Le Grand Continent about how to re-enchant, to capture, to come up with a cultural New Deal, and how to put enchantment back into our perceptions of this complex continent and the neighbours around us on that continent. And in that text, he suggested the idea of rediscovering ourselves, our own continent. And when we talk about a great narrative, I'm not convinced myself that there has always been a single narrative about Europe. And I think, in fact, there have been changes, shifts in the narrative that perhaps after the Second World War, it is true. There were people, political leaders, hugely inspired political leaders who launched this project, but it also corresponded to very practical, material considerations, very immediate considerations. How can we produce coal? How can we produce steel together? How can we reconstruct the continent after the war? It wasn't just never again. It was how to rebuild our economies and to reconstruct a human space. And this very concrete vision of the construction of a common whole is something this is something I've rediscovered. It's not something that's abstract or inspired. It's really a question of doing practical things, and I rediscovered this when I went to the UK in 2014, 2015, where I find myself plunged into the public debate in the UK revolving around Europe, but also the writings by historians and analysts from Britain, and Tony Judd, notably, who in 1996 published a book called The Grand Illusion, and you can find it in French. It has been translated, and that book I really encourage anybody who has heard the discourse in France about European construction to see how the narratives can vary around the European project. And I think I agree entirely with the idea which Giuliano wrote, which is to propose a rediscovery of ourselves and to multiply our views of each other, because I grew up and I was educated largely in France, and I was surrounded by a certain discourse about Europe. But when you change countries, change region, the things are seen and felt differently, and within countries even there are differences. And so what I see is fragmentation of these narratives and of the perceptives even within our society, and Mathieu studies this closely. And I would say that perhaps to put a bit of nuance into the notion you've both mentioned of a total loss of any positive notion here. I was a student and started working in journalism not long after the fall of the Berlin Wall. That might seem a very long time ago. Now, there's a whole generation which has grown up since which isn't familiar with that. But that reunification of Europeans who for 40 years after the Second World War had been separated by the Iron Curtain, that reunification remains a huge gift offered to us by history. And contrary to what many say to us in France, it is an accomplishment, a major accomplishment of the European project. There are other factors involved, of course, but many young people pre-COVID had the possibility to travel to Prague or to discover or to meet people who come from the parts of Europe which we could not go to for 40 years. And I think that there is a huge amount of beauty in that. And I think we really need to know each other better. In Europe, we don't know each other very well. There are a lot of misunderstandings, and that lack of knowledge of each other opens up a gap for demagogues who say anything that's outside our national borders is potentially a threat. And there are plenty of people like that with the rise of this sort of discourse. Chauvinistic, nationalistic discourse, which is very dangerous. A study came out just today from a think tank explaining how perceptions of Europe have been damaged by the COVID crisis, but at the same time, ultimately, nobody really wants to leave the European project or to break it. Brexit is a sort of singular occurrence. Very singular occurrence. It's interesting, and after those two presentations, we're now going to continue our conversation. Nathalie, you talked about a fragmentation of the narratives. Mathieu, with more in common, this is something you look at closely. In a comparative view, you study a number of democracies in crisis. And how does this fragmentation happen? Is it due to social and economic divergences, or is it caused by divergences in our imagination, a loss of belief in that common destiny? That's my first question for Mathieu. And even if we do manage to write that great narrative together again, as Giuliano said we should, even if we do manage to put together that European Marabaratra, will we manage to touch a majority of the population, or ultimately is this only going to be received well by a small, educated minority? Laurent Goudet, who is with us here at the forum, wrote an epic poem about Europe, but how many people have read it? So that's what I'm getting at here in my first questions. Thank you very much, David, and I'm delighted to be with you. It's a huge regret that I can't be with you, because whenever we have had conversations with David, Giuliano and Natalie and the other people who are in the room today, it's always given me something which I'm missing at the moment, which is the energy to continue this work, this effort, because my starting point, informed by the current situation, by the past and by the future, is why do we need a narrative? It's because it's better than the current national discourse that we have in France today, which is stifling and dangerous. Personally, I just want to reach beyond that. We need to protect ourselves into something greater, bigger than that, and that's the importance of this narrative. But David's questions involve the understanding of the field we're working in and the tactics of it. How can we understand our audience who wants to hear this narrative? That's the work of More in Common. So to present us very quickly, we are a think tank. We work in Europe and in the US, using tools from psychology to understand the psychological orientation of people in relation to populism, the fragmentation of society and polarization. So we have some quite precise analysis tools. And to address the question of the narrative and how we project into the future, we need to know what our starting point is. And we look at that with a new view from today to see what can be possible in the future. And I think that one of the characteristics of the situation today is the fragmentation in this narrative or conversation, which is a fact. That is the way it is. If we just talk about social media, and I think social media do have a massive influence on the national conversation, on politics and policy, on the media. Many of the new media are reliant on the social media to find their readers, and therefore they propose fragmented narratives. I think this fragmentation is a fact we have to live with, that we need to understand, but perhaps to contribute to the conversation, perhaps what I could provide is an analysis of where we stand today and where public opinion stands today in Europe, and why we have come up with this question of how we find a new narrative, and also how we propose some avenues to see how we can work towards a narrative that does excite the public and a much broader public. So to keep it very simply, we find that in our Western democracies, there are three groups of people. You can see our studies on the internet if you want. There are 20% of people who are very open, and it's these who are the people who are very much in France attached to their European identity. I note that these are the only people who are very or only attached to a European identity. For the others, the European identity doesn't necessarily mean much. It's not that they're against it, but they don't really think much about it. So these 20% of open people, there's a closed group with a very marked opinion on Europe and very negative opinion, and then there's 60% in the middle. And it's these 60% of people in the middle that we need to look at for a moment, because they hear the suffocating national conversation which I suffer from. That's the result of the 20% of the very open people shouting at the 20% of closed people, and vice versa, who dominate the national conversation where a narrative should take shape. And one of the reasons why we're lacking narrative is that the production of the narratives no longer involves a majority of people in a country like France. So it is always useful to remember this, but 80% of tweets that are published on Twitter, obviously Twitter is not France, It's not life, but it is an indicator. 80% of the tweets published on Twitter are published by 2% of the web users in a country like France. They really dominate the national conversation, but they're only a very small number of people. And although it is true that in a country like France, the fragmentation does exist, notably on the question of identity. For example, if we take the question of the memory of France, which has been a central subject, it is a subject which divides. Should France be looking into the darker pages of its history or not? It's a question which divides people. And there are also signs of a desire for unity, as in all the countries in Europe. So there is a genuine appetite to try to write a story together, which might not be as evident when we say, do you think we do still form a whole, or are our divisions too great? People say, yes, we still want to advance together, to move forward together as a national community, and like other circles of belonging. Europe perhaps is less means less to a large majority of people. That's where the bubble effects come into play. You have the impression that European identity exists in the head of many people, but I'm not really sure that's the case. They're not against, but they're not really for. But they do want to say us, we. And the question that comes up is, and that's why we look into this question of the narrative, is why are we going to say we? What are we wanting to do together? And that's why I think this conversation about narratives is essential, because it's this will to project into the future, into tomorrow, and which people are lacking today. There is also the question, I'll perhaps say this, there's the question not only of the narrative and the content of that narrative, the story of us, as the Anglo-Saxons say, but who is going to tell that story? And there's a problem of story, of narrative. There's a lack of narrative, of story. And there's a lack of storyteller, the person who is going to tell that story, because there are a lot of people putting out messages from the elite or from other political groups who are no longer being heard by a majority of people. So there's a problem of what we're saying and who is saying it, and that's also very important. But I'll stop in a moment, is the elements of the narrative that people want. And just to give you three ideas, and then I will stop so we can have a conversation. The first thing is the notion of being a hero in a book. I don't know, like, if some of you, like me, people want to have a narrative that takes them on board, but they want to have a real role in that narrative. This notion of agency, they want to play a role. We see this on the climate question, where people people in France or Germany want not only to recycle because it's for the planet, but also I'm happy to recycle my yogurt pots because it gives me something to do. It gives me a role in the narrative, and that is essential. I don't just want a narrative that I read and that's all. It's not really going to work. The second thing.
So secondly, they want to have a story or a narrative that's positive, that describes, without too many technicalities or public policies, the end of the story. What will my happy life be in your new story? Don't talk to me about the institutions, the technical changes, the intermediate stages. Start by describing the end to me. What will my life be like? How will my life and my children's life be happy after this narrative, after this story? So they want to read the last page of the book. And the third thing, and I think that's a more general element, rather than look at the narrative through a thematic approach, the environment, health, purchasing power, I think we need to take on the new codes of storytelling. That is to go where there is energy. We're working on a project where we're looking at businesses, music festivals, what's positive what's taking place that's positive on Instagram. So go to look where the energy and the joy is. And I think that's even true after COVID. People are going to want to move towards energy and joy, and not necessarily to a specific theme, and we need to embody it, and we need to learn from these sources of joy. And I agree with Nathalie saying that that energy exists across Europe, but we're not telling the story of Europe well enough. It's boring, and people are not being absorbed by it. And I'd just like to talk about an observation that comes from our studies in Europe. When we ask people, do you think that in order to get out of the COVID crisis, we're going to have to remember that we have to invent a new world? And that brings us back to the story. And 65% of Europeans say yes. The COVID crisis reminds us that we have to make changes to our system, positive changes. They want to look at the world after, and it's not just elites and people on Twitter, it's most people, even in the middle, the average French person. But if we ask people, do you think these changes will come? Do you believe that the system will bring these changes? Then Europeans, 70% of them say no. So there's a real gap in hope. The Europeans want to see a new world, the world after, but they don't believe it's going to happen. And it's in this gap that we have to bring our positive narrative, our positive story. Thank you, Mathieu. You're bringing me the food for thought for the questions for Giuliano and Nathalie, the why, the who, and the how. So starting with Giuliano, on the why, the goals, the objectives. Mathieu talked about ecology, but we'd have to look precisely what we put in that idea. A narrative just based on selective waste sorting or driving an electric car is not a very exciting one. And today we're seeing narratives from the extreme right that can be negative, but they're full of energy. They're talking about civil wars, the war of civilization, finding our roots, finding our power, becoming ourselves again. So we see that there are civilizationist narratives that can be based in fantasy, that can be false, that can be dangerous. Those are value judgments, though, but the energy is there. You said earlier the stimulus plan. We did lots of positive things in Europe this year, but the billions of euros, the civil liberties, will that be enough to provide an equivalent energy that will be able to erase or overcome the tales or the narrative of the extreme right? Secondly, Mathieu said that Europeans feel very strongly about their European identity in a very narrow sphere, but there are 60% of people that feel vaguely European, but they're not as attached to it as to their nation. So how can we get that European attachment to improve? How can we attach it to our national attachment? And then I have lots of questions for Nathalie. Thank you. Those are very easy questions. I'll be able to answer them in just 2 or 3 minutes. So what we're seeing is that it's more difficult to present a positive narrative compared with a negative narrative. And that's the reason for which we're surrounded by the negative visions of the future. It's not just the apocalyptic scenarios of replacement or nationalist or nationalist populist messages. It's everywhere in the movies and books. What works the most are stories with a negative future. And there's a simple reason for that that's linked to the nature of the human brain. We grew up in the savannah, and when you're in situations of risk, then when you're in danger, we have to evaluate the negative messages, the message of danger. Our brain is trained to overreact to a negative message, to a negative prospect of fear, of danger. Because from an evolutionary standpoint, we need to behave this way. And so we have more difficulty in general at all levels of producing and attracting people's attention to positive stories. But we don't need to stay on this point for too long. It's true that English journalists, when they tell you about something that they're doing, they write an expression called full disclosure. They say, I'm going to talk about a topic, a company, and I have to tell you that I'm a member of the board of this company and that I work with these people. So for full disclosure, with Mathieu and I are working on the beginnings of the drafting of positive narratives and positive federating visions for the future that can counter this mismatch, this unphasing that Mathieu was talking about with respect to people's expectations in our post-COVID phase and the feeling that they have that there are no narratives that meet their expectations. We've started with the idea that we wanted to look at examples of positive narratives, positive stories that create energy, that can that can suck people into them. They can be environmental movements, Fridays for Future, or Sunrise in the US, and lots of other examples. They can be more civic operations. There's an example in Switzerland, a very interesting one, and other ones in Brazil. We're not strictly limited to the European dimension because we're not working exclusively on a European narrative. There are also festivals, artistic performances that can capture people's attention. And what we see is that if you try to propose a positive narrative, you need what I call indicators. We need factors that reinforce your narrative. Mathieu talked about some of them. He talked about the importance of the role that each of us can play in the transformation. There are others, but there's one, in my opinion, that's very linked to European Lab and the experience of European Lab, and that's the festive, happy side. We often forget that side when we talk about populists, nationalist populists. We often think that they're angry people that are there focusing on their anger. There is that component, obviously, that's present. But there's also, if you study nationalist, populist movements from the inside, you see that there's a very festive, happy component, very federating, a lot stronger than what we could imagine from the outside. And I find it quite striking to remember that Marc Bloch attributes in part the failure of French society and European society at the beginning of the 1940s and the end of the 1930s to the fact that we didn't sufficiently organize enough parties, enough festivals, enough moments where people met up. We didn't really focus on people's enthusiasm and collective enthusiasm. Recent research was done on those who were left by the wayside, a part of the population amongst the least engaged in the public sphere, and they have a desire for connection through these festivals, through personal relations, is very strong. And I don't think we need to underscore that within the framework of European labs, because and the organizers of Les Nuits Sonores, because you're very aware of that. And to come back to the European narrative, and David, you talked about this briefly in your introduction, there's the theme of our roots that's very strong. And we see that the most effective movements today against nationalism and populism are those that can take over the idea of our roots. In Switzerland, a movement claims against the Swiss populace. It's Blanquer. It's a very important movement in Switzerland. They want to be patriotic, anti-immigrant, etc. And they claim the real Swissness. They've managed to reframe the dialogue by saying that Swiss roots, Swiss values are represented by us. And the German Greens are another interesting case, and we'll see how the elections go in September, but they're doing well in the polls so far. They're trying to get out of their image of the urban young people. They're saying that they have traditional values, partly living in nature, establishing a different relationship with nature. And of course, that comes back to our roots, values, and traditions. And we shouldn't be afraid of talking that way. And my last point on this topic of roots, I was struck in a recent debate by what Van Middelaar was saying, who's a huge expert on European affairs, and he said, and this was on the day of celebrating the 71st anniversary of the European community, and he said, if we want to rebuild an interesting narrative for Europe, we must firstly say that Europe isn't 71 years old. We have to be honest about that. Europe is a lot older than that. And if we try simply to say that Europe's only 71 years old because that's when we decided to unite and construct Europe, we'll never manage to find something deep and interesting. Of course, that complicates things, because if we go back further in history, we also have all of the darkest moments of European history, the most conflictual aspects. There were wars, racism, colonialism, a lot of very dark experiences, but there are also the overcoming of those experiences. And so once again, since we're talking about the European narrative, the intensification, taking into account our roots, is going to be fundamental. Thank you, Giuliano, and I'm going to turn to Nathalie. Mathieu asked the question why. Giuliano has started to give us some elements, but it also asked the question of who, and I would say how also. How can we bring forward new narratives when a bigger number of people have become illegitimate, the traditional message givers that are politicians, journalists, those who have made narratives their profession. So in the moment of crisis of representation in general, and not just political representation, How can we talk about the real? Laurent Jean-Pierre in France said that the Yellow Jacket crisis is a crisis of representation at the political level, but it's also a crisis of representation at a metaphysical level. We say that it's impossible to have discussions on politics or a narrative on politics because it never corresponds to my daily life. The second question, Mathieu talked about it earlier, the public debate is in shreds. The media are increasingly dependent on algorithms of social media, Twitter, etc., for their own economic model. So we're really closing ourselves off in silos and cognitive bubbles. So let's suppose that we can find the right messages and the right objects. Will we have the right people to give the message, the messenger, and the right channels, other than our own little communities of like-minded people who are spontaneously waiting for these positive narratives? When I think of the European project, I see lots of different stages. Often when we talk about Europe, we imagine a bloc of countries that have always, and institutions that have always been there. And for 70 years, that's not true. It evolved over time and reacted to different political and international contexts. I think we have to bear in mind this idea of change, of evolution, of fluidity to a certain manner of the European project, of our European reality. And Mathieu said there's the 20% on one hand and 20% at the opposite extreme and 60% in the middle who really don't know, who are perhaps indifferent about a lot of topics. And I think that in moderation, the absence of extreme passion in these 60%, there's a real richness. Pierre Asner, I think, wrote a book on passion, the period of passion, his last book, and he warned us against passion. Here we're talking about narratives or stories that carry everyone and bring us all in the same direction. That will never exist. And let's be careful about an overdose of passion. We need to counter the passion of nationalist populists with our own passion. I would think about that twice. Yes, we need positive energy and positive thinking, but I don't think passion against passion is the solution. I hesitate on that. Having said that, Giuliano mentioned Marc Bloch. In Marc Bloch's book, he talks about the media. There are 2 or 3 pages on the media, not very many. He talks about media in the 1930s. And what does he say? He talks about the connection between politicians and media at that time. And he says that those public actors were trying to get their crowds to vibrate like a musical instrument, that the crowds weren't thinking anymore. We were getting them to vibrate for something or against something, and we forgot that sometimes you have to calm things down a bit, give the real facts calmly, explain things, describe things, and that questions are complex and simple answers never work. For and against never works. And I think we need to look at Europe as it is, which it's a very complex continent. There's a beauty in this complexity, and we often say that devil is in the details. And I think in Europe, the beauty is in the details. That comes back to all of the cultural dimensions. Our richness, our wealth is in all of our multitude of differences, including the nations. The nations are the diversity of Europe, and this diversity is the wealth of Europe, our richness. It's a continent where we've managed to build something. We talked about Bloreur and the Swiss, this movement against the populists saying, hey guys, you say that you're the big defenders, the big patriots in Switzerland, but it's us. Why? because we're basing ourselves on our constitution. Switzerland was built on a constitution. We work in this way. We have different languages, different cultures, different territories, and we have a constitution, and that's what makes us proud. And I think that we can inspire ourselves from that. To think about Europe today, and I think a very good expression is to say that in Europe, we have principles. I don't want to talk about values, because you open up too many doors, things that can touch beliefs and religion. No, I think more of principles. The principles of Europe that we have, our heritage of these last 70 years, is in the Charter of the Fundamental Rights. That's not only talking about human rights, but social rights. And this document was adopted 20 years ago. And I think that, like the young Switzerland who are fighting against the nationalists and populists in Switzerland, saying, we're proud of our constitution because it says that we have certain rights, and it protects our liberty and our possibilities. So how can we make our life a beautiful life? It depends on our freedom and our laws. We have that in Europe. There are some democracies elsewhere, but in Europe we have a combination of things that we find in our charter. It should be part of the arsenal that we have in TED. We should be talking about it in our schools, in our high schools. And this charter says more than simply democracy and human rights. It talks about social rights, and we can add to that a very great role for all of us in Europe, and that is to participate, all of us together, in the preservation of the planet, and to do it in our continent, in Europe, and then also to play a role beyond that throughout the world. And I find that's a really great idea. I was talking with my stepdaughters who are 20 and 21, and I said I was going to come and talk about the great European narratives, and I asked them, what is the European narrative for you? And it wasn't easy for them to answer, because there's a lot of confusion. When we talked, they came up with two ideas. Europe would be great if it got rid of poverty in Europe, and it helped to eradicate poverty elsewhere. And the environment, our ability to live in a dignified way in an environment that we respect. And those two things don't come from me. They come from my 20-year-olds, and I think that those two ideas are two great ideas, because there's so much that we can do. And once again, to celebrate, Juliana, you were talking about celebrations. We need to celebrate these millions of details and our differences, because that is the specificity of Europe, the fact that we have succeeded, and to have all of these differences grow within us and to allow them to cohabitate. And I'll finish with one point. I was never the correspondent of a newspaper in Brussels, and I respect the work of those journalists who follow the European organizations. They're so complex, very few people understand them. But I think that in the media, we've limited ourselves to that narrative of the different stages within the institutions. And I think that the media has a growing mission, and I think people here are thinking about that now, that we need to be the vehicle, the place where human stories can be told, the human stories of this continent. So we all have experiences in our lives that go beyond the borders of our country, that link us together. We have an ancestor that comes from another region of Europe. Perhaps we've lived somewhere else for a while. And I think that those narratives, those real stories of Europe are not talked about enough and not celebrated enough. And I think we need to celebrate that. We need to feel connected to each other. We're a continent where there's a lot of mixing. We need to celebrate that. And I think that that could be an answer to those who want to feed fear and the closing of borders.
So we're running out of time, but I did want to ask you about what you thought as constitutional patriotism, which is often seen as being nothing but constitutional patriotism, and can this lead to discussions of rights? But I wanted to ask Mathieu, as we have just 3 minutes left, and Giuliano for that matter, for a quick conclusion on the initiative which you briefly mentioned that you are conducting on the battle of narratives. What are you going to be doing over the next few months? What is your schedule? Because at the European Lab here, we will be following you very closely. If Mathieu, you would like to say something? I'll let Emiliano present that as a team who is steering that initiative with us. Just to say that we're going to need a lot of allies, will lots of support, but I'll let Giuliano tell you what we're planning for the coming weeks. Thank you. In fact, I'm in a psychologically awkward situation there because I am stuck on a mountain here to put the finishing touches to our first report to be published at the end of June in a few months' time. The project is called NSC. It comes from a quotation, an apocryphal quotation from Saint-Exupéry, who says, if you want to take people on a journey, don't show them how you make the parts of the ship, but show them the horizon and the infinity of the horizon. So I am quite terrified at the idea of being on this trip. At the end of June, we'll be proposing a first stopover to stick with the metaphor of explorers. It's a little bit as if we were arriving on the coast, not of America, but of the Azores. So we have just left the shore and we will have a first stopping place, which will be very participatory. We will be issuing a text, a newsletter, there'll be podcasts, things like that, a whole series of things, all the things we're doing today. So I'm obviously a bit older, but I am trying to learn how to communicate in today's world. But we will be trying to launch hypotheses or assumptions. Some of these will be a little provocative because we do think that the energy. Natalie is right. I agree about this. We need to be serene in the face of the national populists. Often the strategies that work are those of calm, the sort of Biden approach. But to generate energy around a new narrative, I think we are going to need to address a lot of different points of view on the basis of some provocative starting assumptions, but I can't tell you anything more for the moment, and I do invite you, if you are interested, from the very last days of June to go to we'll have a website dedicated to this undertaking, and from there on we'll be able to begin this dialogue together. So you're inviting us to the Azores at the end of June. That sounds interesting. It's not the worst time of year to go there, for that matter. Thank you to all three of you for taking part in this first discussion on these new narratives. Nathalie, Giuliano, Mathieu, thank you. I'm sure we'll see you again very soon, and we will invite you back, I'm sure, to talk about the work that you are doing here at the European in the lab because we are very interested in all that. And in a few minutes' time, after the mandatory break, we'll be moving on to a second panel discussion with 3 more speakers on European models in this context of reassertion of the geopolitical powers like China and the US. So we'll be continuing our journey this afternoon.